أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. I seek refuge in God from the accursed Satan in the name of Allah, the source of mercy to all of creation, the source of mercy to the believing congregation. All praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and may the peace and blessings be upon His holy prophet and his immaculate family. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. My name is Ibrahim Fontaine, and I'm happy to welcome you here this evening for our first webinar on anti-racism and awaiting Imam al-Mahdi. I'm very happy for everyone to be here. I myself serve on the board of trustees at Yasin Ed Foundation here in Los Angeles. And I'm very happy that we are joined today by our dear sister, Marguerite Aziza Hill from the Muslim Arc Foundation. Sister Marguerite Aziza Hill is an adjunct professor, blogger, and editor, and freelance writer. And she's the co-founder and executive director of Muslim Arc here in of the Muslim Arc organization. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a quick moment to introduce some of the organizations that actually came together to sponsor this wonderful event. As I mentioned before, I'm on the board of Yasin Ed Foundation. Yasin Ed is a foundation that was founded here in Los Angeles in 1998 by a diverse group of young American Muslims that were trying to facilitate their Islamic educational needs as students. And although it was initially known here locally as a youth center, Yasin has grown over the last 20 years to a diverse Islamic center that aims to empower individuals with knowledge, skills, to navigate the spiritual challenges of the 21st century. Also, the Shia Muslim Council here in Southern California is a community platform that was created to facilitate and exchange ideas and experiences to enhance and support the religious and educational development initiatives like today's webinar. So SMC actively cooperates with other like-minded organizations to advance this unity amongst Muslims. And the Shia Racial Justice Coalition, whose goal really is to connect the larger Shia Muslim communities around topics of anti-racism, anti-Blackness, and racial justice. We aim to facilitate continuous action in local Shia communities through dialogue and projects by bringing experts and scholars together. And of course, Muslim Arc that Sister Marguerite represents really is one of the pioneering organizations in this space as a human rights, educational organization. Muslim Arc, over the many years, has worked to cultivate solutions to advance racial equity and connect people to foster a multiracial network and create spaces for learning and developing racial equity. So we're here today just to kick this off. Before I invite Sister Marguerite to as our expert here to really help educate us and on some approaches to discussing a lot of these issues. This webinar was set up as a resource for our community in the recent aftermath, of course, of the national protests that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd. And although these issues of racism, anti-Blackness, oppressive policing, etc., although they've recently, been in the national headlines, we realize that, many Muslims in our communities, may not be directly affected by them, or, have really engaged in in-depth conversations around these topics. We entitled it, the title that we get, included the term awaiting Imam Mahdi within the title of this program, because we know that the divine government of Imam Mahdi will remove all forms of oppression and establish justice within our world. There will be no systemic racism. There will be no opportunity for large segments of our society to, act on their biases, based on invalid biases based on skin color and our ethnic background. And so, intidhar al-faraj, one of the most, one important part of our faith, to actively await for the return of Imam Mahdi, really has a internal and an external dimension. Internally, it encourages us, it establishes the love for the establishment of truth and justice within our hearts. It really encourages us to create an affection towards our fellow humans, fellow creatures, with a desire to improve their situation towards goodness and prosperity. Because we know with the return of Imam Mahdi that, this benefit is going to be experienced by all of God's creatures. And of course, we know that this mission is nothing less than a continuation of the mission of our Holy Prophet. May the peace and blessings be upon him and his family. All of his work throughout his life in working to establish Tawheed, he took every opportunity to remove the systematic oppression and bias and prejudice that people had during his times. So with that sort of ground rules of sort of why we're all here, with the goal of we're hoping that through this conversation, we'll be able to leave our viewers here with a desire to sort of go and understand, like, how to have these conversations with people around them, and how to become active within the community and the larger society, around these topics. So we'll pass it over to our dear sister Marguerite. For you, feel free to go in whichever order you think is best. We definitely are very interested in learning a little bit about yourself, and how you became motivated to, kind of work actively within this space. And then also, a lot of the, explanation. I know you have some slides prepared for us to kind of walk through and help us break down a lot of these words that are used in discussing these issues.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me this evening. It's truly, truly an honor and a privilege to be here. Still across the country, there are protests. Currently in Seattle, there are a lot of peaceful protests, but it was declared a riot, and that protest in Seattle is in solidarity with Portland, right? And so, and many of us have been either at demonstrations, trying to practice as much social distancing. But at the same time, it's, we are in a moment of crisis with COVID and with the death of, like on video, just watching, just seeing that, like, it was just very, I think that at this time, like people are just say, like, we've had enough. And all of those conditions, right, have led to where we're at now, where there's this deep awareness across the country within Muslim communities and this call and reckoning of our own, whether it's complacency or lack of understanding around the issues, around police brutality, around the criminalization of Black communities, but also on Black mortality. Because in reality, those deaths on video are a reflection of the fragility of Black life. And what does that mean? So, I mean, I guess like in general, like for, a lot of people may ask, like why get into this work, right? Like why should we do this as people of faith? When in many ways, like some people, like within our own country, there's this whole idea of like separating faith from politics, but our ethics, right, inform what we do. And in reality, it's like when we think about our own religious spaces, like what motivated me to become Muslim as an 18-year-old in that first exploration was really about it was a critique of white supremacy, and much of that was like filtered through like the words of Malcolm X, understanding Muhammad Ali, the even with the hip hop artists and street, like there was a lot of people. You had like a lot of urban intellectuals, organic intellectuals, people in the streets who were Muslim, who were talking about systemic racism, but they were using different terms, right? But they had a deep critique of the system of oppression that impacted Black people, that impacted the global South. And at that time when I embraced Islam, it was that reclaiming my humanity and it was deeply tied to theology. So there is like, I have a little short chapter, a contribution in How We Fight White Supremacy. And I talked about my own religious journey, and I called it like the small pilgrimages, like the ziyara, like of different places. And at that time, going from like the South Bay and the Bay Area to the East Bay, and discovering my own self, discovering Islam and taking my shahada in these spaces that affirmed my Blackness, affirmed my humanity, was deeply tied to that. Now, for many Black American Muslims, like we've embraced Islam as a rejection of a Christianity that was deeply Eurocentric. And that was like the tradition that I was taught. Like we were taught the image of God and Jesus as being white, but also like who was on top of that order, who benefited. And so, over the past few decades, to see that kind of diminish some, like within mainstream Muslim discourses, as far as like, what does it mean to be Black and Muslim? So that was, as I embraced Islam, like, and coming into Islam, you embrace it, right? And then you have to like with that, with the idea of like, yeah, like you can't say you believe, like say you submitted. So there's that submission of embracing Islam. And then it's like that process of learning, what does that mean, of embodying that. But also there were encounters that challenged my own identity as a Muslim, like as a Black woman, that experiences that made me feel like I didn't necessarily belong within the broader ummah, that dehumanized me, dehumanized, like either erase the history of my people, either diminish the contributions of people like Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, question whether I was legitimately Muslim or not because I was African American. So, within about, I would say over 15 years of that, I became very passionate about exploring racial identity formation. So like my graduate work was on identity formation within the Muslim world, right? So like looking at that deep history. And mind you, this was also following 9/11. So I had questions as far as like, what did the world look like outside of white supremacy, outside of European domination? And that was like one thing that I thought was really beautiful of studying Islamic history, the 1400 years of our history. And only recently, right, you have European domination. So it's not like a given that within the world order, the pecking order, that Black people have to be subordinate. And so it was that promise, right, of like 7th century, looking at those early texts, looking at that early ummah, of seeing how a multiracial ummah, like of that community, especially in Medina, of different ethnicities coming together. And they were, like if they had not had that bond, right, like they would have been wiped out. And where would I have been, like, had I not had Islam? And so for me was taking inspiration from those historical, that deep history where Islam embodied that anti-racist ethos. Um, And then thinking about how do we challenge that, right? We have all of these sayings, but in reality, what I was seeing as I was teaching in Islamic schools, as I was going out in community, when I traveled abroad, while there was many beautiful experiences that had truly affirmed my identity, my multiracial friendships, the friends that I met before I had any degrees, no one knew who I was, but they embraced me as, even when I was a college dropout, like I had nothing to offer, but they loved me as their sister. And I knew that there was something about Islam that was still powerful. And so I held on to that. So I became Muslim 93. By 2011, as I started to see anti-Blackness on social media, because some of those instances I was like, oh, that's individual. It's not that big of a deal. Or, or maybe it's just me when I started experiencing what we'll define microaggression. So I thought it was me as an individual. But when I saw how widespread it was and the impact that it was having on young people, especially those who did not choose to be Muslim, and for those people who are growing up as Muslim in Muslim communities experiencing racial discrimination, made them want to move away from the community. So I, as an educator, I felt it was my responsibility to not just call it out, but to work with others to establish education programs where we could train leaders who can go back out into their community and to call us in, right? Like as a community to live by those principles that we hold to be true. Because I mean, we all know the Hadith, we know the Quranic ayat, but there's some things that are keeping us from embodying that. And so to unlearn those behaviors, right? Like whether that's like our own internalized racism, which gets projected out, or our own sense of racial superiority, which does occur. I mean, it happens in the Muslim community, like you have asabiya, that's real. Nationalism, which is, excessive nationalism is sinful. Like that's like that bigotry and chauvinism. And so like, how do we unlearn that so that, that young people, even like little girls like my own daughter. So she was a deep inspiration, and thinking about all the other little girls who grew up who may not like themselves because people comment on their curly hair or when they get a tan. Like, how do we make sure that our communities where our children not only stand up for justice, like it's mentioned, like what we're commanded to do in the Quran, but that they fully embrace who they are and fully embrace each other.
Wow, no, absolutely. And the example that you gave there, sort of like, mentioning your daughter, definitely, really resonates from some experiences that, that I've had just when even trying to like kind of talk about like, what is racism, what is prejudice, what's discrimination, because I know I've sort of I feel like in general, in the past, even amongst a lot of young people, when I've asked at the masjid, like, or can you give me some examples of when you've observed racism, within society? You'll sometimes you'll get examples like, well, oh, why someone treated my mom, just as like a out of family, someone treated my mom, rudely, and I'm pretty sure it was because she was wearing a hijab. So this is their example of like what they have understood what racism is. Say it's like a teenager or something like that. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of like, for that audience and even for the parents, like kind of help us really kind of clarify like what how we should be using these terms, the precision that comes along with them.
Yes, yeah, it's so important, right? So I'm gonna do like a little, I think I can't do the screen share. I'm not sure if you're able to do it, but I can also go through the terms, right? Like as far as
okay, let's see.
how do we
Are you able to now? Let me see.
see?
We'll get you the screen share, no problem.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I
You
mean,
should be able to do it now.
Angela Davis talks about, it's not just a matter, I mean, we could talk about race all day, but if we don't know how to talk about race, then we're going to find ourselves in some major problems. So we have to know how to talk about racism, and especially given that, you know, like one, we have this kind of deeply rooted within our tradition, right? And so this is, you know, so this is the kind of question, what is the impact of racism in your community? And so sometimes, you know, like people are deploying those terms like everybody's racist, and or saying things like Black people are just as racist as white people, if not worse. And so, you know, we're here to kind of debunk some of that, because what we're really talking about, and it doesn't necessarily diminish discrimination or prejudice, but when we're really talking about racism, we really need people to understand these as deeply harmful and have led to genocide, right? Like we have the process of genocide. We're in a genocidal settler colonial state. So, you know, obviously like we have this, and this hadith from the last sermon, right? Like this has been, you know, like a lot, you know, that, you know, we're all created from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab. A non-Arab has no superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a Black, nor a Black has any superiority over a white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, that Muslims constitute one brotherhood. So this seems like amazing. Yes, we should be, you know, but we know that one brotherhood, right? Like we've fallen short. Like there's a lot of sectarian issues, you know, like we have to really acknowledge that religious, ethnic minorities, if you practice different, like there are people that want to stomp that out. And there's also been where Muslims have been trafficked historically, like where you had even people like, that's where like Uthman Dan Fodio in West Africa, where he was like, when the Hausa rulers were enslaving other Muslims. And similarly, like in North Africa, they went into West Africa and were enslaving other Muslims. So that doesn't, we know like we're not all living by this all the time. But sometimes this is flipped around, you know, like say for example, like where people like, they may say like, oh, Black Lives Matter is asserting superiority, but we know that's not asserting superiority. Or when we don't like addressing, and, you know, like anti-Blackness, there's, you know, but what we want to really highlight is that globally, right, we've had the past 500 years of a system that has ensured that Black superiority is not a thing. Like that is just the biggest myth. Like there's no, that any individual act of Black prejudice is not going to leave an outcome that leads to unequal outcome of like health outcomes, wealth disparities, or anything of especially of the white community. So we'll kind of, you know, so I think that's important for us to talk about. But I just wanted to highlight this, that if we want this to be true, we have to address the system, right? We can't just focus on the interpersonal. And so I'll go through those terms. I think it's very important to define terms and come to a shared agreement, and to also acknowledge that, and even if we Muslims want to sit there and like want to deny psychology, because psychologists work in whether critical race theory, there's psychologists that work on racism, sociologists work on racism, economists work on racism, health professionals work on racism, historians work on racism, legal professionals work on racism. So, you know, like there's a lot of people like critical race theory is not conducive to Islam. Well, how we understand these social terms is important, you know, and that if we understand that these systems that we're using this language of psychology across these disciplines, these help us understand the problem. And if they're not incompatible with our faith. So I think one important term to really think about, you know, like one, you know, like a lot of these we're talking about social identity. So ethnicity, and I'm going to bring up like the difference between ethnicity and race, because race is a social construct. Ethnicity is also, you know, it does have its own social construct, but, you know, going back to like race, as a social construct is a group of people considered to be related in a common descent or ancestry, and it's often linked to phenotype, whether skin color, hair texture, and facial features. We know, like, so initially when racial theories came about during the Enlightenment, or, you know, like it's this, that they had a few categories of race. So they had like Caucasoid, right? And then they had Negroid and they had Mongoloid, and they didn't know what to do with certain other groups. So they kind of put them off in different categories, you know, and they had like Semite, you know, like, so there's these kind of terms, right, that they use. And here's a picture of like Asian peoples, right? And there's not one Asian phenotype. Similarly, like if they went to like African race, like there's no like Negroid one phenotype that says like, this is the one thing that makes somebody Black. But, you know, we still know like within the ordering structures of this society, if you do the census, what categories you have? You have white, Black, Asian, Native American, and then Latinos and ethnicity. So it's like, it's not a race, right? Similarly, like Arab is not a race, it's an ethnicity, because I've seen Arabs of different races, even Arabs that are Asian, you know, who may grew up in Malaysia, maybe have an Indonesian mom. There's Afro Arabs, there's Arabs with blonde hair, blue eyes. But ethnicity is a group of people with common traits, backgrounds, associations, referring to cultural background. And within each race, there's like ethnicities. So I wanted to make that kind of distinction, because some people, like, they get really confused, and, you know, and then they don't, you know, like, even if you're saying like, what race does that make like people from the Middle East, right? Like it just gets the racial categorization where you have people from Sudan who are classified as white because that's how America defined it. So race is a social construct. Just because it's a social construct doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Money's a social construct, but it matters, right? So it's just like, there's certain, your credit, right? Like, it's just like your credit score is a social construct, but it matters how you get into that house, your ratings, like your schools, like all these things. So social constructs, things that people make that define us, matter. So I think what you're, you know, like the thing when we talk about discrimination, that's also important, you know, like in that, that final, like the last sermon, it's saying like, we shouldn't discriminate, you know, and that you can't say one group is more pious than the other. But we know that people discriminate, which is, you know, according to this definition, the practice of treating a person, a group differently from other people. And just to kind of go a deeper dive, the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on grounds of race, age, or sex. So if you're male or female, so we know there's discrimination across those. Like, we discriminate against our children. Do we think that they're believable? Sometimes we're like, no, like, you know, no, Junior, we're gonna have more respect to Baba. So, you know, discrimination is something that people do. And even stereotypes, like attitudes, beliefs, feelings, and assumptions about a target group that are widespread and considered normal in the public sphere. These can be positive or negative, but all have negative effects. Stereotypes are used to justify the oppression of the group being stereotyped. And especially for those who are marginalized and not being, you know, because like there may be like positive stereotypes around, you know, like
one group like being smart or something.
Yeah. And so, or just, you know, like, hey, you know, like I've seen a lot of people who've internalized white supremacy have very positive stereotypes about Europeans, you know, like they're, you know, and just totally ignore, like they'll talk about Black on Black violence, they'll talk about Muslims fighting, but I'm like, did you see World War II? Like, I mean, do you know how many, like, you know, so there's a lot of things that they won't use that same analysis for Europeans, but they'll blame, you know, like they'll have a filter. So here's like with these slides, like really great links, but this study here, it shows where based on how people are dressed, that's how they are racialized. So probably like in the middle, like if you saw the guy in the kind of informal wear, like he would be raised still as a person of color, but in the suit, you just think he's a white guy with a tan, you know? Like, so it's just kind of like, how do we, like, our mind, and it's natural, right? Like this idea of like simplifying information is very part of like our survival mechanism. Now, privilege is something that's socially constructed. So these are the benefits and advantages given to a member of a dominant group in society because of their membership in this group, from which members of other groups are excluded in part or all. So I remember when I got my my master's degree from Stanford, and I read it, and I was just like, here's all the privileges that this imbue, you know, they're like, here's your degree and all the privileges that this gives you. So what does the privilege of going to a place like Stanford gives me? It's like, usually I could walk into the room, and if people say I was a Stanford graduate, they assume I'm smart and that I know what I'm talking about. It doesn't mean that I earned that, or even I'm an expert on that, right? But it's like,
Right.
I have the privilege of being able to teach college because I have a master's degree. So it's like, even that, like, it's still it is an earned privilege. Like, I worked for that degree to be able to get that. Meanwhile, like some groups of people, you know, like they may be given privileges, right, of seeing as authoritative figures just by being male, or just by being a privileged member of that society. So like, for example, like, I mean, maybe like somebody from a South Asian background will have to prove his credentials and being able to recite Quran and understand it. While in Arab, usually they kind of assume, there's some assumptions that they know what they're talking about. You know, like when they read Quran, like less correction, you know, it's like you assume that they understand that, you know, like I don't see as much credentialing or questioning. But other people who are non-Arabs may have to like really go through the motions and be like, no, I went to this school, I went to Darul Uloom, like I studied with this person, let me just show you my abilities with sarf and tajweed, like all of those things. So sometimes like there is racial, like ethnic privileges within our own community. And so, you know, privileges aren't good or bad per se, but they just are. And when people have them, they may not be aware of those, like the challenges of those who don't have them. So this is an important term because like some people will be like, oh, like they don't like the terminology. And then kind of going into like understanding like why when we talk about racism, institutionalized oppression, and this is like when you're talking about how this is embedded in institutions. And so this picture here is like, you know, this is showing like the soup lines. And then here's an image of like a white American family over top, like showing this, and this is during Jim Crow America, like where there were laws that discriminated, you know, there were housing exclusions, there was covenant laws, there was things that were embedded in American society, and that prevented that caused the economic impact of the Depression, or anytime there was any economic, like it would be worse for African Americans. And so these are laws and customs and practices. And, you know, the thing that we want to think about even in our own institutions is like how do our institutions replicate that? So I'll put a pause here. Like I have a lot more definitions. So if you have like question, then we can kind of like bounce some ideas off of, because it's like, that's a lot of definitions.
Yeah.
I just want to go into like, what does this all mean? And
what does this all mean? No, you know, and no, I really appreciate you walking us through those, and just for our audience, as a reminder, we actually you know, please are taking questions now. If you have any questions, you know, for Sister Marguerite, you know, or any reflections on some of this, some of the information she's presented so far, you know, please you know, send your questions through Slido, you know, hashtag YaMahdi, YaMahdi. You can go to Slido, SLI.do, in order to log on with your mobile phone and ask questions. And so, you know, and so sort of backing up, I think a little bit, you know, and thinking about, you know, I guess, you know, in my, you know, from my own personal experience. So or I guess trying to summarize it a little bit, it's like stereotypes are the ideas that people may have and discrimination can be when people act on those ideas, right? But it becomes institutionalized oppression really when that happens at a large enough scale that it really negatively impacts a particular group of people, at a large scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, so this is like this is where it intersects, right? Like when you have the individual bias and prejudice, right? And then when that is combined with social power, then that equals the system of racism. So racism is like that ism, right? You have like capitalism, which structures how our society is, like on money, free market. Socialism is another ism. We don't live in a socialist world, but like a socialist society. Sexism, it's a way of ordering society, right? So racism is a way of ordering society and ascribing values, right? And privileges and the value of individuals and rights and privileges and resources and protections along racial lines, and the assignment of who's worthy, who has ability and a value according to their race. Like I added, like I combined these because I wanted it to be as comprehensive. Racism is any action or attitude, conscious or unconscious, that subordinates an individual or group based on skin color or race. It can be enacted individually or institutionally. Systemic racism is discrimination built into the way organizations and governments operate, often involving informal activities and cultures. So this is the racism. We're not just talking about schoolyard teasing, right? Even though schoolyard teasing, right? So like, and I could say, like kids can be very mean to each other. So, and this is where sometimes people are like, yeah, the Black kids are just as mean, or they're being bullied. But, like when I was a little girl, and this is like, I'm just showing my age, like I was a little girl in the 80s, and this is before Black history was enacted. This is before Martin Luther King Day was even a holiday. So it's just like, there's very little that was enacted. But those little kids that I went to school with understood slavery, right? And so with their bullying on campus, reinforce this stuff. They would do the whole, you can't drink out this fountain, Marguerite. They knew what segregation was, right?
Wow.
Like they knew you get in the pool. So those whole things where Black kids were prevented from going, like they used to, like if you were Black and you put your foot in the pool, they would drain the whole pool. Right. My mother, when she, like my mother, they had went to the South and they ate at the restaurant, and the restaurant broke all the dishes that they ate from, and that's like, so those are the kind of things like that caste system, right? Like, so what we're saying is like that the racism is this, and that's different than prejudice. So there's no reverse racism, right? And like Black people aren't going to take, like there's that joke, right? Of kidnapping millions of Europeans, forcing them to work for 400 years and blah, blah, and creating this system, like a caste system. So you may have prejudice and discrimination, but it's not equaling this whole system. So what we're talking about is like justice, and then also how individuals reinforce that, like where they may either adopt that status quo of racial hierarchy and internalize that and replicate that in their interpersonal interactions.
Wow. Yeah. Got you. And you're right. You don't even have to sort of go back, too much in history, obviously to see how, certain things certain things within our society sort of make it easy for Blacks to experience different outcomes within society. It makes it easy for people to act upon their their stereotypes and prejudices to perhaps inflict harm on others. Something that so here in Southern, actually something that happened with me just a few years ago, here in SoCal, I was living in a neighborhood called Palos Verdes, and basically had someone call the cops on me because they thought I was trying to steal my own car. Went running out of my house, to go pick up my daughter from school who was running late. And so whoever there in the neighborhood, saw a, middle-aged black male, running and jumping in a car and speeding off, assumed that it was a car theft. And we only found all this out because when the cop came up to our house and, was looking, was looking around our house, suspecting that some crime had occurred there, had his hand on the gun and holster. And we only found all this because our neighbors saw him, right? Our neighbor, saw him coming and was questioning, like, officer, like, what's going on? He was like, oh, we got a report of a, potential, car theft, from blackmail, et cetera, right?
And how common is that? I had a, it was late night and in the South, I was in a neighborhood, I had a rental car and I had a flat tire, and the police, instead of helping me like with this flat tire, I was like, like, and I was scared, I was by myself. And in this neighborhood, they called the cops to say I was a suspicious vehicle. And so what happens, there's so many occasions, whether that's like a break-in and then the cops are willing to arrest the homeowner, or you're trying to get into your own home, and those encounters, right, when they have, and we know, like, there was the brother who, he was a Haitian immigrant and he was in his own home. Somebody, like the police officer, came into the wrong home and shot him. So these, like, the fear, like, one of my friends who is a South Asian Muslim, and she was talking about how she would rent Airbnbs while the owners lived there. And I was like, that's really scary. And she's like, no, they're more afraid of us than them. And, so she's talking about, but I was like, that's exactly what gets us killed, right?
Exactly.
Like, it's just like in those deadly police encounters, or even where the owners of homes kill us, so another example is just kind of like, there's like Renisha McBride, and there was another one during Hurricane Sandy where a woman, she had her 2 sons, and it was during a hurricane, and she was scared, like everything was flooded. She had no place to go. She went to knock on somebody's door, and she had her sons, and they were afraid of her. They were afraid of a woman who had 2 sons in need, and they kept the door closed, and her sons were swept away in that storm. That is what stereotypes and racism does, right? Or it has, like, a homeowner justify shooting a woman through the door. So yes, there's certain neighborhoods where I'm thinking, like, what is more likely for somebody to see my skin color and assume I'm a threat? Or is it like, where am I likely to be safe as a Black woman? And frankly, in a lot of neighborhoods, it's mainly inner city neighborhoods where I'm safer. And those are neighborhoods that many of our co-religionists kind of flee because they see other neighborhoods
Safety.
as safer.
Yeah.
Right. And there's studies that show that that many Muslims follow patterns of white flight. So it's like how they perceive, like, white suburbs as being safe, or following gentrification patterns. So there's ways we've internalized that. That kind of goes into the next one, like the 3, like we talk about, like the 3 Eyes.
I was going to say, maybe before we jump into that, we had a couple of questions that came up, and actually this one is actually somewhat interesting. So someone has asked, are there, and I think we had to break this down a little bit, are there lessons that the Muslim community can learn from the Jewish community when it comes to dealing with racism? Because response to anti-Semitism is very strong.
Well, I work in a lot of, like, collaborations and multi-faith collaborations for anti-oppression. And there's a lot of work that they're working on in addressing white aspirationalism, like alignment with white supremacy, right? Of not being able to address their own white privilege.
Oh, within the Jewish community.
Yeah,
right?
within the
Oh, okay.
Jewish community,
Okay.
right? You know,
Yeah.
so, and then just, you know, and I'm just gonna like call it, because like, I mean, I studied like, in some ways, like my, like studied like Jewish ethnic, like minorities in the Middle East. And so you have like Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, and you also have Black Jews, right? So there's a lot of like racism against like, so those internal conversations that we're having right now, the Jewish community is having around Jews of color and dealing with like white Jews. And so as far as like what Muslims like, or what lessons we could learn as far as like dealing with anti-Semitism, I mean, I don't necessarily, I mean, I know like there's like kind of like the work on Islamophobia, or just being able to call it out for what it is, right? You know, and I think that in some ways, like they're able to call out like the conspiracy theories, the, you know, and then sometimes like there's other things like when you're critiquing patterns of like, you know, because like in the 50s, like they engaged in redlining. So I mean, I would just be kind of be careful of like ascribing to like a group that attained whiteness, and is that the road we want to go down, especially if we're supposed to you know, like address oppression, and then saying like, and then being able to weaponize certain identities to silence critique. I don't know if that's like what we want to do, but at the same time, I think we have to be ever vigilant of racism against Middle Eastern, South Asian, Black, you know, Black Muslims, and be just like very vigilant and calling out Islamophobia and making it unacceptable. Like it's still very acceptable. And we need to really call it out for being a like upholding white supremacy. And I think that we fell short as Muslims when we limited our discussion for many years around anti-Muslim bigotry to like religious rights, because we have a country that like is free for all critique of religion, right? But like not acknowledging, right, that in many ways, like white supremacy, like whiteness developed in opposition, like the Orientalism. So read Edward Said, you know what I'm talking about, but it's just like that whiteness saw like Islam as a foil to Christianity. And so like, it's very important that we become sophisticated in calling out anti-Muslim policies and bigotry as bolstering white supremacy. So we just need to, like, however we want to use the term, but we need to be clear about that. So I would say similarly, like, and very similarly, like whiteness did form in the, you know, like in that late period in the Iberian Peninsula, like especially in the Iberian Peninsula, but even in, you know, like is in looking at Judaism as a foil, as they were like this other that was racialized.
They were this other, similarly, during the Inquisition, right? Exactly.
Yeah, it was ethnic cleansing. We were subject to that, right? So, so I think that they've, you know, there's some scholars that have you know talked about that, and I think that we also have to be very clear and not like aspiring to how they like Jews or Catholics attain whiteness, but like we just need to be authentic with ourselves.
Very, very, very good point. I had some ideas along the same lines, but I couldn't figure out how to articulate them like the way you did. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, you know, we don't want to necessarily follow that same path, especially like you said, the way that it's been used to, you know, to weaponize any critique, against them, and basically, being able to gain that privilege by, you know, becoming more and more a part of the larger culture of white supremacy, right? That has happened to some extent, but that is good to know, like you said too, that of course within Jewish communities, they are having, you know, because in that way we are very similar, right? That there are a lot of these internal discussions within the communities that they're having also. The other question, I don't know if you want to save it to the end or and jump into this, but we had another question that someone asked of just like, you know, are there any other experiences of, I guess of racial prejudice, you know, or racism, I guess maybe you can clarify which one it was that you've experienced, just as a, African American, within the Muslim community.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been a lot. Like, I mean, I grew up in like like I had lived in like Santa Clara, and there was like, for example, like one other Black woman there, and they're like, you must be sisters. And you're like, okay, like, so sometimes like not knowing, like it was just that sameness, right? That they kind of can ascribe or, but I mean, some of the things were like very subtle. Like, I mean, the first time, like as I started to learn Arabic and when I lived in the Middle East, like it started to become a little bit harder to be like, okay, like they're just saying certain things, or wow, like that person, like when I understood like they're referring to me as slave, like that was really jarring. And the first time like was very tangible when I was in Kuwait, and a little boy, and it was like in the Badoon neighborhood, like where these are like, like in Kuwait, they rendered people stateless. Like if you could not prove your certain identity and stuff. And the little boy like looked in the car, and we're, like I was with the family that was like Nigerian and Somali. And he just looked up and he was like, Abid, like this gave us a dirty look and said, Abid. And it was just like, he just called us a slave. Like the different pay rates, right? Like living abroad, like they ask you for your picture and what you look like. And when you start talking with people, and you'll find that some people like Europeans will get way better pay than African American teachers,
So that's potentially, so that we can say that that's definitely like an example of, of racism practiced by, let's say, like the Kuwaitis, in this sense, towards teachers of color versus the, the community member that, just assumed that, oh, these two, African American sisters at in the masjid, like they just must be, sisters, or they must be related or something like that.
That's like the interpersonal, right? And then, but sometimes it could be like institutional. Like, I'm trying to like, I've had like a number, and like one of the, and someone's like, okay, do I want to relive that trauma? Like going in, like like of the, whether it's the interpersonal or going into a store, and you have like the store owner speaking to me in a way that's disrespectful, just, seeing just over time, like how certain groups, so for me, it was like very hard to like to put words to what I was experiencing, because there was a lot of like what we call as gaslighting. Gaslighting is like where you deny people's observations, right? Like it's like, like you may deny like their observations that certain groups of people may be more welcomed or likely to get the job. So applying for a job and no response, right? Like, or going someplace and no one speaking to me. And that, like I came into the same time as a white woman to a mosque, and we both were strangers, and the whole group surround her and ask her, why did she become Muslim? And I've even experienced that with Black people who are like, kind of have a proximity to white, or who are perceived as white to South Asian and Arabs. And just like, I'm just sitting there, there's no one talking to me, and but this deep interest in like, why would this person become Muslim, And so a lot of it was like the interpersonal reactions, and then justifications, right? Like, so the things that would be kind of frustrating were like the ways that people would justify that discrimination. So for example, I wrote an essay about how I don't get salams, like I would say salam alaikum. Even times like I went to the store, and with, another person that was right before me came in, didn't know anybody there. The store owner gave that person a greeting because they appeared Arab. And then I come in, it's like as a woman, no response. And so I would see how I was treated as a woman in Black, and then how other people were treated. And I didn't, it's like, how do you quantify all of that? Is very difficult to quantify. And then also certain social issues when you're in discussions and a diminishing, right, of like issues like, Black Lives Matter, but this is before we had the terms for it, like if we're talking about poverty in the US and, things, and blaming Black people for their conditions, while at the same time, like they could still talk about underdevelopment theory. Like Muslims tend to be very politically savvy and astute, and they could talk about underdevelopment theory in Muslim majority countries, but yet that understanding doesn't apply to communities like Black and Native American and Latino communities, right? So those are the kind of things, like I would say, like without getting too much into like, oh my gosh, like what are the things that would just make me kind of depressed or angry, like, or just kind of like,
No, those
also
are.
I don't also want to backbite too. Like I'm just like, man, I could tell you some stories, and then somebody may feel like I was called out, oh, you ever
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, we definitely don't want that. But I think those, those really, like you said, kind of illustrate, how, yes, sometimes within Muslim communities, individuals can really kind of not be uninformed, and not really realize sort of some of the incorrect ideas about people of color that they've absorbed from the larger society, right? Black. So,
and the stories I get are way worse than mine. Like the things that people share with me, I'm just like, from people like Black delivery men, they refuse to open the door because they're afraid of the Muslim man that's delivering the kanafa, like it's just like, so you have like that kind of, like, or the calling of the police on someone, or just like that, like I've heard so many, like people confess to me, like, and certain things like they discuss, like from their children not being taught in schools because they have a Black parent, people being pushed out. I've been pushed out of prayer lines, like people refuse to pray with me, like, so it just happens. Yeah.
Whoa. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess, because I guess we're coming, I guess, towards the end of our segment here, but I wanted to, these three eyes that you have up here kind of, really intrigued me, that. So I definitely want to have some time for the audience, for all of us to kind of learn, and, how to distinguish and correctly articulate the differences between these different dimensions here.
Yeah, so I mean, we did talk about the institutional, and we're talking about like whether even like with policing, so everybody's like on the streets about that, right? And so we're kind of, and then, but we were called to reflect on our own internalized, like, how we've internalized anti-Blackness in Muslim communities. So I just wanted to kind of also bring up too, like, most Muslims by far are people of color, right? We've internalized racism. And if we say like even internalized Islamophobia, like anti-Muslim stuff. So this is like our acceptance of the dominant views of racist views, stereotypes, and biases of our own ethnic group. And it gives rise to patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that result in discriminating, minimizing, criticizing, finding fault, invalidating, hating oneself by simultaneously valuing the dominant culture. We all got a racism problem. Racism is jahiliyyah, right? Like when you have that story, like, we should all know, like that story of Abu Dhar, like having the jahiliyyah in him. We all got this jahiliyyah, right? And it could be like internalized. And when you value the dominant culture, and the dominant culture is telling you about this other group, how are you going to treat that other group if you just think they're like, whoa, amazing? So,
I'm so glad you got a picture of Uncle Ruckus up there, man. Uncle Ruckus really is a perfect, the epitome of that reality.
Exactly. And we all know somebody in our own culture that'll blame, they'll be like, it was so much better when we were colonized. I've heard Muslims say that. So lots of times, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, the interpersonal as we go to, so like after we gone through the institutional, the internalized, that like I wanted to kind of like then switch to the interpersonal is when someone discriminates against a person or group simply because of their race. And just highlight what makes a difference between discrimination and oppression is power. Racism, discrimination plus power, plus the force of 400 years of oppression and systems that are killing people. Like, it's not just like, oh, the principal of the school, because I've heard people like, oh, you know, like they've said like, maybe like they've been in a work environment and the principal has favored Black people over. So that's racist. And it's like, yeah, it's mean and it's wrong, right? But it doesn't equal this thing, you know? And so, and it doesn't mean it shouldn't be, it's illegal, you know, but to discriminate based on race. And so, you know, kind of tied to that is that implicit bias, the preference for or against a group. So like, you can't really do this interpersonal without having internalized this bias. And a lot of times our actions aren't really conscious. And the only way that we can kind of address that implicit, like the things that we do is when we start to become aware and assess our own bias. So there is an implicit association test, but you have to go even deeper than that. You have to think about, how was I raised to think about all these different groups? How was I raised to think about myself as a person, as a racialized person? We're all racialized, whether you're white, Black, Middle Eastern, Arab, Iranian, like we're all racialized some type of way in this society. Think about like what has taught us certain things, and then to really consider like, you know, how do I replicate that, right? So you know, so this implicit bias work is really important, and the only way we could kind of check it is like sometimes it's doing our own personal audits of like, what are our affinities, what are our patterns of behavior. Now, because a lot of that is not conscious, it leads to like a microaggression, which is sometimes like those slights. It's like a brief commonplace behavior, verbal, environmental indignities that we may perpetuate against other people. And this is especially like when we think about Muslim spaces, which are like considered like healing spaces, where we're kind of maybe like our own, like we're like, you know, what I find is like a lot of times people look for a group of people who are just like them so that they can kind of feel safe, right? And so what happens in that group, like if our mosque is our cultural club, and that's how we see it, and then we start to have to encounter and deal with difference, we may commit microaggressions, or we may just be used to it because of how we've been socialized. And a microaggression doesn't have to be intentional. And this is where we challenge, like with our Muslim faith, right? Like a lot of times people say actions are but by intention, and people say that they didn't mean to. But if you think about that story of Abu Dhar, where Abu Dhar told Bilal, like, oh, you wouldn't understand, you son of a Black woman, that was a microaggression. Yes, Bilal's mother was Black, you know, and even they still like Abu Dhar, like by all means, like he was a Black Arab, like they probably their same skin color, but he dismissed him based on his identity. And it was like, and then, you know, Bilal didn't give him 75 excuses. Bilal ended up going and complaining about it. And then when Abu Dhar went to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet said, you have some jahiliyyah in you. So then Abu Dhar didn't say, well, what I meant was, he didn't make all these excuses. Then he went and immediately apologized. So when it was brought up to him that he did this thing that offended his brother, right, that reflected jahiliyyah, reflected some of that asabiyah, that arrogance, right, that superiority, he immediately apologized, and that apology was accepted. So that was like the cycle of Tauba. Like that's what within our anti-racism framework, it's a archetypal story. But like a lot of times what happens when somebody is called on this microaggression, so there's many of them that do occur. For example, like if you say certain things like pronunciation, you speak English, you speak good English, you know, depending on like how I pronounce your, you know, you pronounce that so well in Arabic, you know, or like people like, you know, like what happens when the Black person goes to the community and people had their bags out, you know, like it's just like, do they move them? You know, what are kind of things that we may do in our mosque spaces? Because we know what's like certain like microaggressions against us and how do we may perpetuate that. So these are
Yeah.
kind of like the thing that is like, and I like the snake in the grass image that Namir designed. It's like they're hidden, but they could still sting, right? They could still bite. They're still poisonous. And a lot of times people will deny, like they'll deny that, oh, I didn't mean that. And you as a person that's bringing up the microaggression, or say, for instance, if somebody's like, doesn't want to pray, and then you just notice it, you know, you're like,
Just
wait, somebody
notice.
doesn't want to
Yeah,
pray,
yeah,
or like they're not inviting me to
yeah,
this, or they're avoiding talking to me. It's very micro, and it kind of goes into like this categories, right, of like, you know, there's these like categories of like micro insult, often unconscious, micro invalidation, which kind of denies your experience, you know. And then there's also like the micro assault, like where people do like the subtle jabs on who you are. So those tend to be more conscious. It's the
yeah.
microaggressions that tend to be based on bias that has, because the people haven't done their unlearning. And that's like where the hard work. I would say finally, like for microaggressions, like it's really important for those who do have more dominant groups, or if you're dealing with people, like we have to learn how to apologize, like how to interrupt a microaggression so that we can say like, you know what, like I'm sorry, you know, like I need to go and learn a little bit more on how to be culturally sensitive. Like we need to learn to make our spaces inclusive, and doing that is thinking about our language, how we behave, and behave towards each other and deal with difference.
Inshallah, no, absolutely. You know, that really that really nails home. I know with like some, you know, conversations I've had with my wife, you know, even reflecting on our own family, on some of the, I guess you, like you said, like kind of microaggressions that sometimes come in the form of compliments. And, you know, probably anyone here on the call, you know, whether they're African American or maybe from other backgrounds, knows how much, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of bias towards fair-skinned individuals, right? You know, so when you have, you know, so when you have people in your family, like, you know, I personally do, you know, that are vastly different skin complexions, right? You know, I have you know, a daughter with, you know, that's much lighter, you know, has lighter eyes, and you know, and a you know, and a son who is a, you know, a good chocolate color. You know, we've experienced times when someone you know, just really, oh, mashallah, oh, she's so beautiful, oh, look at her beautiful eye, mashallah, oh, blah, blah. You know, but that same sort of like compliment on how beautiful it didn't happen with, you know, with the browner one that was that was right there, right? And it's, you know, people don't realize that this type of you know, internalized bias can, you know, even though you may mean well, and of course it is nice, of course, to compliment young kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, compliment kids, and you know, but
Yeah,
you know,
or the like she's pretty, but like no, she's dark but cute,
but
you know, so you get that. You're beautiful, like for, you know, you're so smart for a Black. So it's
yeah,
those
you're so
things. It's like you
smart.
can't be dark. And so there's ways we have to think about how we've internalized colorism, how we've internalized ability. And so, you know, when we think about that and we kind of like, we may get corrected, and part of getting corrected is that refining, that's the sharpening, that's the like, you know, refining our own character by like thinking about like, okay, I may make mistakes, right? Like, and other people may make those mistakes, but yeah, like, I mean, we experienced that, you know, like, and the children, like, it leaves a devastating impact on children to
Right.
witness that. And that's the thing that really, it leaves an impact on individuals who may step away from and not want to be part and being part in community. And that's a heavy responsibility. If our responsibility, right, is to create community amongst each other, but if we're like, yeah, I'm the person that made this family not ever want to come back to that masjid, never want to come back, and then eventually they felt so alienated that their kids had no connection with, like, it's just like, it can lead to that. Like, but if you're just like, hey, I learned to be more inclusive by checking my own internalized racism, by checking my own language, like how I was taught to talk with people and to value people, then, like, it does make a difference. Like for me, like, I know if I didn't have friends who had an anti-racist ethos, I wouldn't be here. And every time, when I think about my accomplishments, I'm like, it was that one sister that gave me a ride that one day, and they took me to that camp. I stayed with them for a week, and I learned to pray 5 times a day. Like those are the things you think about, the kind of cycle and the benefit, the baraka that you get from being like embodying the sunnah, the prophetic ideal, and like that community. And, I've even learned a lot about, like when you're saying like the society that the Mahdi would create. I mean, imagine like those people that is like, it's really hard for them. Where will they be? Like, if they're just like, I don't really believe in racial equity. And like, it's just like, they're going to be like in opposition. That's a really scary place to be. So they got to get some practice and be like, we embodied that ideal now, because that's something like, it'll be like, a beautiful world. Like that's the world that we're trying to create, so it's like, and they'll be comfortable in that, as opposed to like, I just lost my privilege of dominating everybody. Like it's just, I wouldn't want to be in that dominating.
We don't want to be on that side. Yeah. So I guess in wrapping up, because I think we're just about at time, are there any like sort of last closing suggestions that you would make make to our to our audience here, just about like perhaps, okay, someone's listening to this, they got some of these ideas or concepts, or around the precision that we can use these with these terms. What are some good things to do next, as far as like engaging their circle, or their social circle, family, spouse, sibling, children around them? What are
what are 3 ways we can do to counter racism? And I know we said like in our work, like this is saying our work, but our life. I mean, I think we can like, one, like, I mean, we have a pledge. I think the language of the pledge was like very beneficial as far as thinking about countering the scarcity model, countering like being, closed. So, I just encourage everybody to take the pledge, to read the pledge. Set some goals, right? As far as like, what is the world that we want to create? How do we want to kind of connect across difference, right? Like, how do we want to show up for justice in this moment where a lot of people are putting themselves on the line? So what type of movement work we want to do? So there's a lot of, depending on like what your inclination for the first step, and that may be like starting out with that whole self-assessment, then learning, and committing, and being engaged in justice work. Like some folks ready to march, but yet they haven't done that internal work. So be committed to it, like with us, for this long-term work, so that when it comes time to like start building out, because like, my concern is you have some of the same people that are marching. Those are some of the same people that are calling the cops on us. Like it's just like they're the ones that are like doing the hiring discrimination, in their .coms, so it's like, and the housing discrimination, because they haven't checked that in like that implicit bias, right? Like they haven't looked at, like the job applications. When they see Jamal, they'll be like, Jamal's a Black guy. I know there's brother Jamal Diwan, and most people think he's Black because his name is Jamal. Like it's just like, but Jamals are so discriminated against, because that is like, it's considered like a Black name. Tons of reading. So here's like my collage of reading. From an institutional level, there's like really like, I think for anyone, this book in the corner, the Racial Healing Handbook, is just really, really powerful, like for that self-reflection journey. Start reading if you can, watch movies around, like videos, depending on like what modality of learning You can listen to anti-racism podcasts, like you can watch anti-racism videos. If you like books, we give you a whole, like, here's a list of great books. And depending on what your profession is, like, there's books for you. There's a book for you, like for anti-racism. And we can share a reading list that you can share out with your, like for those who did register. But yeah, start with that. I mean, with Muslim Arc, definitely with the pledge, that'll get you in contact with us to do that follow-up long-term work. There's lots and lots of resources. This is lifetime work. So don't think like one organization, one thing, one action, but just unfold and learn and be like, wow, like be curious about this journey. Don't feel like, you know, it's too much, but just like, you know, some of the ways we've been taught to think about people and things, like it's such an incredible time that we're seeing. And a lot of it is like, you know, with that work of those organizers, decades, and many of them were Muslims who were in prison that were doing the prison rights work. Muslims have always been engaged in criminal justice reform, always been involved in Black Lives Matter. Some of the more prominent Black Lives Matter are like Muslim or Muslim adjacent. Like, so it's just like, you'd be like, or like how much they've been, and Black radical tradition is also deeply tied to Islam, right? You know, the Muslims in the 60s. And so like, these are just anti-racism books. There's like a whole, like, get to learn about, you know, Black contributions to Islam. So there's like Dawood Walid's book, right? Like there's books on history. There's even like, when I was talking with some people, I was just like, you know, a lot, like whenever I talk with Shia, like they didn't know how deeply Shia West Africa was or North Africa, you know, like just how, you know, the role of like Black Shia historically. And I'm like, that's something we have to like unfold. So like, let's learn history together. And, you know, so I would say like read, watch videos, listen to like lectures, and also just get outside your comfort zone and kind of go to spaces that may not be like part of your affinity group. Like step outside and like find out more about, you know, like, I don't know, there's like, I think there's like even one community, they're like East African Shirazi Arabs, you know, like, but they're like East African, like learn more about that history, maybe go see what they do in their congregation and, you know, reach across the aisle, because a lot of times we won't know each other's issues until we have those real authentic relationships. So it may have to be like form authentic relationships with people, invite them. Well, now you can, I mean, you don't have to invite people to your home anymore, so you don't have any excuse, but you can invite them to a meeting, a Zoom meeting. So it's just like, we have Eid, invite people to your Eid family celebration, because a lot of times, especially for those of who are converts, we're all like, we don't even get to get invited, you know, maybe we see them at the big Eid thing and then we go back home and we're like, oh, we're by ourselves again. So come, you know, open your space, but also be willing to go outside your comfort zone and go into other spaces and be part of something where you may not feel like, yeah, I'm on top of this, but I'm still learning and glad to be here.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Yeah. No, absolutely. No, we definitely plan on, you know, sharing this information out, you know, so that people can, you know, be able to easily get access to a lot of the information that you provided here in the deck, and you know, stay in touch with a lot of the great work that you guys are doing there at Muslim Arc. I guess
Thank you.
we will. I guess we'll conclude there. We really appreciate all of your time, Sister Marguerite, to educate us this evening. For our audience, you know, we're planning in 2 weeks to have another follow-up meeting after this on with our very own Hajj Kauthar Khan speaking, and Sister Hana Chandu will be moderating it, and that upcoming episode will be kind of around this issue of kind of negotiating privilege, you know, and potentially our role in systems of oppression. You know, some of the you know, privilege was something that Sister Marguerite touched on tonight, and a lot of us do experiencing that. So we need to really kind of look internally and see, you know, what it kind of means for our lives here within this context. So inshallah, you know, may Allah bless you, give you the strength and the opportunity to continue to do this great work. And we look forward to continued work and collaboration with Muslim Arc, inshallah.
Ameen, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for having me.
No problem, inshallah. All right, take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.